Hi there, welcome to this lesson from LaunchCode, in which we introduce some of the basic concepts behind the ASP.NET MVC framework, and in particular we begin a discussion around one of the components of MVC, the controllers. So let's first review the MVC pattern. We have used this pattern previously, even if you didn't necessarily realize it. And the MVC pattern is what's called the design pattern, and that just means that it is essentially separate from any particular framework or language. It's a way of approaching designing a program that you can apply with any number of frameworks or languages. So when we say MVC, we don't mean anything in particular that's specific to .NET. We just mean that it implements this design pattern that lots of other types of frameworks in other languages do as well. The three components of MVC are the M, the models, the V, the views, and the C, the controllers. Let's look at each of these and briefly describe what they do. The models are what are often referred to as business objects. They are the objects that are part of your application that represent the functionality, well, rather the data and the core sort of interactions and relationships between that data within your application. And so the business objects are independent of the framework. They should really be independent of whether or not your application is a mobile application or a web application, etc. And so as an example, if you think about a blog and the different handlers and the templates and all those things that are part of it, the models, the business objects would be the objects that represent a blog post or a user or a category of blog posts, things like that. The views themselves are how we display data to the user via an interface. And most often when we talk about MVC, we're talking about a web page. Although MVC pattern, the MVC pattern can be applied to desktop applications, mobile applications, and other sort of interfaces. But most often, especially in this class, when we say the views, we mean a web page, and that's usually talking about templates that generate those web pages. The controllers are where we're going to spend a lot of our time, and part two of this lesson is going to focus on controllers in .NET MVC. And we can think of these as the traffic cops. And so the traffic cops here, the controllers are going to handle requests and move data around between the models and the views. They're really the center of the picture, even though they're the last piece of the acronym. They're really where a lot of programmers spend a lot of their time and where a lot of the action happens within a web application. So that's MVC. Let's look at a diagram just to kind of see how these components are typically organized in relationship to each other. So this is a diagram illustrating the flow of an MVC application, a web request to an MVC application. So at the bottom we have a browser, and a browser makes an HTTP request to a web server, right? So that web server, what happens behind the scenes within that server is often to us just using the internet is kind of magical. But within the server, as programmers, we now know some of the mechanisms that get kicked off when a web server receives a request. And so one of those mechanisms is routing, which we'll talk about. That routing and the dispatcher in conjunction with the routing engine will determine which controller to send the request to. And it'll also take apart pieces of the request, request parameters, things of that nature, headers from the request, and sort of package those up in a way that the application can then understand and respond to. The controller is then, again, in the center of the picture, is playing the role of a traffic cop. The controller will receive a request, and usually that's going to be in the form of some kind of method call along with some special objects that are specific to that framework. And the controller will then decide what to do based on the data that's part of that request. Usually that will involve going to the model to get objects related to the application. So if the request is to display a user's blog, we'll have to go to the model to fetch all the blog posts for that particular user. And interacting with the model typically means interacting with the database as well. All right, so data flows from the model to the controller, and then once the controller has the data, it then needs to render that data into a view, and so the controller interacts with the view again. And in our world, this is typically going to be a web page, and typically we're going to be dealing with templates that will help us efficiently create these views. And then once the controller has created the view, it will pass that back through the web server, and the user then receives the web page generated by our application. So that's the basic flow you should have in mind when you're thinking about web applications that use the MVC pattern. Let's talk a little bit about specifically what ASP.NET Core MVC is. So you can kind of have a picture in your mind of what all these acronyms are and how they relate to each other. And we'll quickly kind of sort of drop all the pieces except for the MVC, and we'll just start talking about MVC applications or .NET MVC applications. So we don't have to repeat these jargony acronyms over and over. So MVC is ASP.NET Core MVC is one portion of the .NET framework. The .NET framework is a very large framework created by and maintained by Microsoft, and we'll look at some of the other components just in a second, just to give you a picture of what's all a part of that .NET framework. But just know that ASP.NET is one portion of the .NET framework. .NET Core, when we say core, that's referring to the version of .NET. So .NET Core is the most recent version of .NET released by Microsoft. And compared to previous versions, it's been heavily rebuilt to be cross-platform. So it's the first really cross-platform version of .NET to be released by Microsoft. And as of early 2017, it's still relatively new. And is only slowly being adopted by large companies, but all of the skills you learn within this will be transferable, or you'll be able to sort of adapt those to older versions of ASP.NET MVC if you go on to work in those as well. So some things are the same, some things are different, but in general, you're still working in the .NET world, so all of these skills are going to be very relevant. ASP.NET is the server-side web application portion of .NET. So we mentioned that .NET is this really large package of utilities and tools. That's this very large framework with sort of frameworks within it. ASP.NET is the piece of .NET that allows us to create server-side web applications. And so ASP.NET within it has its own set of components. And in particular, MVC is what you might refer to as an extension of ASP.NET that we're going to use to build MVC applications. So when we talk about ASP.NET Core MVC, we're really looking at one small component of the entire .NET world. And just to give you a quick view of some of the other components of that .NET world, here's just one way to look at organizing these. And if you want to go, I got this image from Wikipedia. If you want to go read more about the .NET framework, I recommend going there and reading about some of these different components and the history of .NET. And so you can see here that there's ASP.NET kind of right in the middle. There's something called the Common Language Runtime. We've talked about that a little bit. That is what's going to provide a lot of the base classes and base functionality within our C# applications. And then there are other things like the entity framework and link that we'll encounter later in this class. And then a lot of things that we won't. So just to show you that the .NET framework is a big, complex world, and we're going to focus in on just a few small pieces of it. Also pay attention to the core aspect of what we're doing. Since there are different versions of ASP.NET MVC out there, if you're looking around for tutorials or documentation, you might see older versions, and if you're not paying attention, you might see something slightly different or that's slightly inaccurate from the world we're working in, which is .NET Core. Let's just show you a quick example of that. I'm going to go over here to the ASP.NET website. And you can see here, even on the front page, there are two download buttons, and one for .NET Core tools and one for Visual Studio tools. If I go to Learn, more specifically, we see that there are different sections of this site. There's ASP.NET and ASP.NET Core, and down below you can see different learning resources linked there under the Core and regular ASP.NET scenarios. So if you want to, again, if you want to look at documentation or resources or other tutorials, be sure to pay attention to whether or not these are ASP.NET Core. There are some things that are common, but some things that are slightly updated or slightly different, and we want to make sure that you're reading the right stuff. Of course, within the course website, we'll always link to .NET Core resources. Okay, so let's go to part 2 of this lesson, and we'll explore how to actually build a .NET MVC application and look at controllers and some basics of setting up controllers to handle requests. Of course, we mentioned that controllers are the traffic cops. That's the logical first place for us to start when studying the 3 components of MVC. All right, so within Visual Studio, make sure you're following along at this point. We're going to use this example application in the future in some future lessons. We're also going to use it in studios and class, and it's important for you to get the hands-on practice with going through these motions and playing around and really solidifying these concepts. So do follow along. I'll try to go slowly enough. If I happen to not go slowly enough, just pause the video or rewind shortly, but make sure you're following along and going through all the steps and tests that we do in this lesson. So go to the File menu and select New Project. And in the left-hand pane, in the Templates section, we want to go to Web. So under Visual C# Web. And then we get 3 options here. Select the ASP.NET Core Web Application template. All right, and then we want to give our application a name. I'm just going to call this Hello MVC. And that location looks good to me. Your location will probably be slightly different. And then these 2 checkboxes are great, so leave those on. The bottom one, of course, creates a new local Git repository for our project, which is always a good thing. And then I hit OK, and we're presented with another option. So I mentioned that there are different types of web applications that you can build within ASP.NET, and the web application template right here is going to be the one that allows us to build an MVC application. So don't click one of these other 2, either an empty project or a web API project. We want a web application, which is the same as an MVC application. When we click Hello, then Visual Studio goes to fetch the components of that template and build out a lot of files for us. Yours will probably go a little bit quicker than this, but in any case, it takes a few seconds just for Visual Studio to go to all that trouble to fetch things and set them up for us. Let's go ahead and look at, there we go. In the right-hand pane, you can go ahead and close this if it comes up. That's just a view of the home page that we'll see in a minute. In the right-hand pane, most of the things we're going to be working with are within the source folder. I'm going to go ahead and collapse the solution items folder, and you can close this restoring packages message if you like. And then within this, we're going to be studying over the course of the next several lessons. We're going to be looking at the different components of an application, the different folders and files and what they do. So there's a lot of stuff here. That's okay. Don't get overwhelmed by it. We're going to look at the important pieces in detail and in turn. All right, so before we do anything, I just want to show you that you already have a functioning web application as part of this template. Just by creating a template project from that MVC project template, you have a web application that's ready to run. So let's go ahead and run it and see what it looks like. Up here is the run button, and notice that previously the run button would say the name of the application we were working on, right? So whatever program we were working on, it would have that name on the run button. This says IIS Express, which might seem a little weird because the name of our project is Hello MVC. But what's really happening is that IIS Express is a web server. It's what's called an application server. It's an application server that's able to run C# code. It's able to run ASP.NET projects. And so when we start up our web applications, our MVC applications, we're really going to be starting up an IIS Express server that will then have our MVC application within it. We couldn't run our MVC application without this application server wrapped around it. So that's just why you see IIS Express. We're not going to really worry about the details of how that works, but if you're interested, again, Wikipedia or MSDN are great resources. So go ahead and hit run, and this will take a few seconds, probably a little bit longer to build than other applications you've written so far. And once the application is built and running, Visual Studio is going to kick us over here to your default web browser, which for me happens to be Firefox here. You might be using Chrome or Edge, but we have our default web browser here, and notice that it's trying to open up this URL, localhost : 57387. Your number here, your port number, will almost certainly be different from mine. For each MVC project that you create in Visual Studio, Visual Studio assigns that a unique port so that ostensibly you could run all of the MVC applications on your machine at the same time and they wouldn't conflict. In this case, the port number I've been assigned is 57387. Again, yours will be different. And remember that just localhost tells the browser to send that HTTP request to your local computer. So we're not actually going out to the external internet here. We're talking to the web application that's running on our laptops. Okay, and so as promised, here's a web application. So there's a lot of stuff here. This is just some template stuff. We're going to get rid of it in future lessons, but it's a good place to look at. I'll show you where these templates and these components that have already been built out live within the application, and it's a good thing to do, to poke around and see how they're built, just as a way to learn some basics around how to build some basic controllers and views for your application, right? So we're not going to really worry about what's here on this home page. Just know that it's there and your application is running. But let's go back to Visual Studio and stop our application, and gonna go in, and we're now going to go in and create some controllers of our own. So I said that the first thing we wanted to do was explore controllers within MVC, because controllers are sort of the heart of the functionality, the traffic cops, as I said. So let's go in and look at a home controller. This one's already there for us. So this is the controller that handled the request to the home page that we just saw. And I don't want to do too much with this one other than show you that it's there. And again, you can learn things just by kind of looking at how these different controllers work and reading the code. So this is going to be, we're going to create our own controller in just 1 second, and it's going to look similar to this, but different in other ways as well. All right, so that controller is already there. Let's go ahead and close it. Go to your controllers folder rather, and right-click and select Add New Item. We're going to create a brand new controller here. Okay. Now on the left-hand menu, go ahead and expand the .NET Core section and ASP.NET, and we see the top item there is an MVC controller class. So select that, and at the bottom, be sure to give your controller a name. Our controllers should always end with the word controller. So we're creating a Hello World type application. I'm going to call this Hello Controller. And then hit Add. All right, so Visual Studio rather, creates this just the minimal controller code possible for us here. All right, so let's see. The first thing I'm going to do, I've got a bunch of these usings up here. I'm not going to use really any of these in this lesson, so let me go ahead and right-click and say Organize Usings and remove unnecessary usings. That'll get rid of the ones that we're not using. If we need to add some of those back later, we always can, obviously. And so notice that I have a namespace hello MVC.controllers. We'll have other sub namespaces within our hello MVC project for our models, but this is the namespace that corresponds to our controllers. Within that, I have a class definition, and I have public class hello controller. And this syntax on the right is a little bit new, and so we're going to get into the details of what the syntax is, but just know for right now that this is the hello controller extending the base controller class. So we talked a little bit about class inheritance and class extensions in Unit 1. We'll talk a lot more about them later in this unit, but for now, it's just important to know that there is a base controller class that's part of MVC, and all of your controllers are going to extend it. All right, and the public here is important. We've talked a little bit about public and private. Public just allows, just makes that controller accessible to anybody that wants to call it. And so all of your controllers should be public. And we have only one method within our controller so far called index. The naming of our controller methods and of our controllers is going to be important in the routing for application, how requests from a certain URL get into a specific method within a specific controller. That's going to be the subject of the next lesson. And I'll kind of show you just how the default behavior works within this lesson, and we'll learn how to customize it later. But right now, what I want to do is I want to modify this just to display a simple hello world message. Okay, so notice that this controller returns something of type iActionResult. These controller methods are in the .NET world referred to as action methods. All right, so typically they're going to return something of type ActionResult. There are different things that we can return from a controller method, but they're all going to be extensions of ActionResult. So in particular, I want to, in this case, I want to return just a simple string. But in order to do that, I need, since I'm bound to return something of type iActionResult, let me wrap it with the content method. So this content method will let us pass in a string, and it will turn that string and wrap it in something called a content result. And it will a content result is also of type action result. Content result is one of these extensions. And so the content result class extends action result. And again, the extension relationships, we'll talk a lot more about those later. But just know that this does satisfy this return type clause here. So by returning something that's wrapped by the content method, we are in fact returning something of type iActionResult. Okay, so there we go. We've got a little hello world string. Let's go ahead and run our application and see what comes out. Again, this always just takes a few seconds. It's just part of the process. We're going to have to get used to it. All right, so it's trying to open up the home page again, but I created a new controller, and so I want to go ahead and modify this URL just to kind of send this request to my new controller. So go up to the URL bar and type /hello. Okay, and we see our message there, hello world. So what happened? Again, routing and how this request ended up at our controller. Routing is a complex subject. We're going to talk about that in a future lesson. Right now, let's just look at the default behavior. And the default behavior is for the path. The path portion of our URL is the portion that comes after the host and port. In this case, the path is /hello. The default behavior for MVC applications is to turn the first portion of your path and turn that name into the controller that should be called. So in this case, by specifying /hello, that specifies that our request should go to the hello controller within our application. All right. The second piece will typically be the name of the action method to be called as well. In this case, that's index. Let me just show you that by typing /index explicitly, we get the same thing. Right? If you leave index off, that will by default, the default value of the controller method is index. Okay, so again, the first portion of the path specifies the controller within which we should look to handle this request, and the second portion of the path specifies the action method inside that controller to call. So that's how this path got to this action method within the hello controller. Okay, so let's try a couple of things here. Let's first create a new controller method and see how that works if we have something beyond an index. So we just want to mimic the method that we have here. I'm going to call this goodbye. All right, and in this method, I want to return a different message. Again, I'm going to use the content method within a return statement to wrap my string in something that's the appropriate type to match this, the controller's signature here. All right, and now I actually have to stop and restart my application. When you make changes to classes within your MVC application while that server is running, you're going to have to restart it to see those changes. So go ahead and stop it and then start again. And again, this will just take a few seconds. One note, while this is pulling up, I want to show you here in, where do we go? Within Visual Studio is that there is a restart button here. I tend to not use it. Sometimes when you hit the restart button, you'll get a build error where the application tries to start up before it's fully done shutting down, which is kind of silly, but that happens from time to time. Maybe it won't happen with you. You can go ahead and give that a shot, but this tends to be an issue with me, so I tend to not use the restart button. I tend to just hit stop debugging, give it a few seconds, and then start it back up again. Okay, so again, let's go back here, and then let's go to /hello to say that we want our request to go to the hello controller. And then I'm going to say goodbye to say that I want that request to go to the goodbye action method within that controller. Okay, and then we see that corresponding message, goodbye. Okay, so again, this is the default behavior. Controller action method is the structure of the path to get to a specific method within a specific controller. I want to show you a couple more things before we wrap up this lesson. All right, so let's go ahead and we're going to change the codes. Let's go ahead and stop our server up front. So far we've only returned text and simple strings. All right, so in future lessons we're going to look in detail at how to return HTML, in particular how to use views and razor templates to generate HTML in similar ways to the ways in which we use Jinja templates to do that with Python applications. But for right now, we're just going to stick to the controllers, and we're just going to be returning content from directly within our controller. So you know, we don't want to complicate things here. We want to isolate our learning on how controllers work. So, but I do want to show you how you can return HTML. So let's go ahead and just try something. Let's go ahead and try making this in H1. Okay, so I'm going to wrap my hello world message in an H1 and start up my server. And let's see what happens. Okay, we'll go to hello because we're just going to hit the index method, which again, the index method is the default controller method that's called if you leave off the controller method or the action method. And we see that something somewhat unexpected happened, right? So we have our hello world message and we have the H1 tags, but they're not rendered the way that we're used to seeing HTML rendered within the browser. I want to show you why this is the case. So here I'm just going to open up my developer tools. I'm going to go to open up the actual HTTP request or response object rather. So all right, so here is the response and request headers that I'm looking at. I'm able to look at these within my developer tools. Again, if you're using a different browser, this will look a little bit different for you, but you can still get at these headers. Notice that if I look at the content type of the response, it says that the response contains content of type text/plain. So the MVC application, the IIS Express application server, when we sent back this string, it said that that string was plain text. And the browser said, since this is plain text, I don't need to render it. I'm just going to treat it as plain text and show it to you. I'm not going to render it as if it was HTML. So to the browser, this is just plain text. We really want this to be rendered though, so we have to go explicitly back into our code and tell our code to return something that is HTML. So there's an optional second parameter to this content method that is the content type. So we can explicitly specify the content type of our response here as being of type text HTML. And again, we're going to need to restart our server. And let's go to /hello. And there we have it. That was actually rendered as HTML within the browser as an H1 element. So while we're getting used to this here and while we're working on the early stages of controllers and returning content directly from the controller, be sure to use the content method to wrap that content, and be sure to also specify that that content is of type text HTML if that indeed is what you want it to be. All right, so in the next lesson we're going to look at routing and how to handle different types of requests, how to customize the default routing behaviors, and how to handle form submission within our controllers as well.